Hey guys, it's Liv here, and in today's video we're going to be recording a bug-type Pokemon tier list with every bug type in Scarlet and Violet so far. If you guys enjoy this and you want to see more, of course, leave a like and subscribe. And with that said, let's break down really quickly how we're going to be doing this tier list going forward. I guess before I get into that though, comment question of the day, what's your favorite bug type in competitive and why? My favorite bug type currently would probably have to be Rabsca. Was Volcarona previously, though when you miss 3 heat waves in a row, you start to fall lower on that totem pole. But overall, the Rabsca is probably my favorite. It's such a fun gimmick this gen, and let me know what your guys' thoughts are. But with that said, let's break down the different tierings and I guess how we're going to be going about this tier list. So we're going to be probably doing a couple of these tier lists as the generation goes on. The first one, of course, is going to be right now with everything currently in Scarlet and Violet. We're going to, at some point when the DLCs have finished, we'll do one just with all the Pokemon that have come through all the DLCs. And then by the end of the gen, we'll probably do one more that will seek out everything collectively, so then it's preparing everyone for when we get into generation 10. That is very far down the road. Right now though, we are only including the Pokemon that are in base Scarlet and Violet. I won't break down DLC 1 and DLC 2 separately because for what it's worth, this will probably end up changing. At the very least, at some point, I highly doubt we'll finish all 18 typings before DLC 1 comes out. So I'm going to wait to do an updated one until DLC 2 comes out at the very least. But currently though, we have any noteworthy bug type Pokemon within competitive. This is essentially basically if the Pokemon remotely had a niche, I threw it on here. This includes the home Pokemon, and I'm going to be speculating where their placements will be because these Pokemon at the very least are already confirmed to be added in Scarlet and Violet. You can find them in the raw data. Hell, if you really were a filthy cheater, you could gen these Pokemon in right now and they would be there. So with that exhibition out of the way, let's get into the tierings. So the S rank, essentially, I'm going to tell you guys right now, the S rank on bug type is literally only for Arceus bug. I'm not even going to, nothing else would compare in theory if Arceus bug was legal in the current format for VGC. If we had like a mythical format that allowed Arceus bug, nothing is going to compare. Truthfully, there's probably a good few tiers below for the next runner up. But for the sake of the video, I'm just going to put the next highest in A. But just note, this S could essentially be an S+++. The gap is just really wide for bug types in this gen. But Arceus bug, I mean, even still, it's really only here because it's an Arceus. I'm going to go out of order for this one in particular because it just makes sense to it, honestly. Everything else, I'm going to go in order for the tier, well, based on the Pokedex. But Arceus, consider that our only S tier. I'm just going to knock it out right now. That is what defines an S tier for bugs, ladies and gentlemen. Moving on to the A tier though, these are going to be for Pokemon that are considered really strong bug types in competitive. They're not going to be your meta stable. They're not going to meta define by any sense, but they'll definitely be an important part of the metagame. This would essentially be Pokemon that you'll probably end up seeing double-digit usage on. While it's not a necessary requirement, you'll probably end up seeing it. The B tier is going to be for bug types that at the very least, they can fit on a team. I wouldn't say these are Pokemon that would necessarily be, well, you could build a team around these, but I wouldn't recommend it necessarily. C tier will get into Pokemon that fill hyper-specific roles. They could fill a specific metagame niche based on whatever top Pokemon was around if it happened to be extremely weak to this. But you typically would only really run these Pokemon if it truly did solve a metagame crisis. Like, for example, if Flutterman was being run and there was a really good Flutterman check that happened to be average in the metagame otherwise, you would probably end up finding it in the C tier. If you had no other reason to run it. D tier is going to be for Pokemon that, these are YouTuber Pokemon. Essentially, you would only find these on a team if either A, they're your favorite Pokemon, or B, if it's for a thumbnail. And the F tier is just for Pokemon that are outright unusable, but they were noteworthy enough to mention because of some hyper-specific niche in VGC that these provide. So I guess, starting off though, we have Scyther. Now, Scyther is an interesting one. I've actually seen this thing, weirdly enough, on some Limitless tours, and I don't know what niche this actually provides. If someone in the comments wants to point this out, I would love to just know why people are running Scyther. For what it's worth, these have been in smaller tournaments for sure, but it's still weird to think that Scyther is even like doing okay in VGC right now, or that people are deciding to run it. And I'm not even talking about in Series 1. No, that would be almost expected. No, I'm talking about in Series 2 VGC. We're seeing like actual Scythers with like positive records, and I just want to know why. I'm just very confused on it. I guess off of the fact that I have seen more than one Scyther make a top cut, I'm going to give it the D rank, but it's only because I've seen more than one do it. I'm very disappointed that this has happened not once, but twice. It's at least been twice. I forget how many times, to be completely honest, but it's definitely more than one time. And that alone is just, I'll be honest, I'm disheartened by that. It's not even that it's Scizor. It's Scyther that is top cutting. I'd have to find the specific tournaments, but you could literally pull it up, albeit they were definitely smaller tournaments. But again, I'm talking like good records from these Scyther teams. I'm trying to find the specific ones, and I've lost track. I just remember finding it the other day, and I DM'd Randy. But anyway, moving on to an actual Pokemon, Venomoth. Venomoth is an actual niche it provides. It's a decent Rage Powder Pokemon, if nothing else. I believe it gets Tailwind support still as well, if I remember correctly. Rage Powder at the very least is pretty cool. This gets Quiver Dance as well. It can essentially just be a pseudo Volk. It does not get Tailwind, but it's honestly fine. Again, essentially just think of this as a pseudo Volk. The one benefit this does have though is the potential for Shield Dust, which does allow it to be completely immune to other secondary effects. This does include an inherent immunity to Fake Out, which is actually really good for Venomoth, because this Pokemon would otherwise have a pretty tough time setting up at the very least. I won't act like Venomoth has a really good time setting up because of Shield Dust, but it at least makes it more manageable in my opinion. So we're going to give this thing a D tier as well. Fortress has absolutely no use in VGC. I couldn't really tell you why you'd actually use a Fortress, albeit if I had to make up a reason, it would be, I guess, for hazards, because if we're gonna look through Fortress's move pool, for example, really the best thing that Fortress actually does provide to a team would be Toxic Spikes, which there are a plethora of better options, even among the bug typing. Like, I'm looking at Venomoth that I just put in the D tier, objectively a better Toxic Spike user, because it also has other support, and Fortress's sturdy ability really isn't gonna be that useful in VGC, especially with how much Fake Out goes around. Objective F tier. Scizor's definitely a B tier. This has been actually creeping up a lot in tournaments recently. I'm going to assume this is probably for stuff like Flutter Mane and Bundle just being susceptible to physical priority, on top of the fact as well that this could in theory run like close combat for common steals or stuff like, I guess Excalibur has been popping up. I could also, in theory, be utilized maybe for King Gambit. I'm not really sure the specific reason. Like I could pull up a few Scizor teams, for example. I know that they're running, like this one that I just pulled up, for example, that someone named Alchemist ran, was an Assault Vest set with Terra Water, with Terra Blast, Bullet Punch, Close Combat, and Next Scizor. I'm not really sure if that's a specific set that is going around necessarily, but I've seen a lot of Scizors actually just in general popping up. So I know it's not just very specific thing that has been only run in a very niche amount of cases. Scizor definitely has been top cutting. Like, I can pull up Nina Bros, for example, and while I know it wasn't exactly like high on the top cut rating, I know that Scizor did place pretty well as far as the tournament, at least considering the fact, yeah, 30 seconds, so it literally actually did top cut. And again, it's a clear amulet set with Terra Steel with Bullet Punch, Close Combat, Sword Sense, Protect. This spawn has been like actually getting usage, and it's overall just a pretty decent pick. I'm gonna give this a B tier. Heracross, I'm gonna give this a C tier. I've heard the argument that Heracross is a better version of Slitherwing. I've heard a couple people mention this in servers. I actually disagree. I think that Heracross, despite having guts and it has a slightly better speed tier, I think that overall one of the biggest things that Slitherwing does have is the photosynthesis ability, which actually does offer a lot for it. Also the fact that Heracross at the very least does miss out on the potential for first impression, which I won't act like you can't just protect around it, but it is still definitely somewhat useful on Slitherwing at the very least. Not only this, but Slitherwing having actual recovery does give some good use, and it does get some cool utility like Will-O-Wisp, which Will-O-Wisp has actually proven to be pretty useful among Pokemon such as Rotom Wash and Arcanine in this format, just due to the insane physical presence of stuff like Iron Hands. Iron Hands, of course, being one of the best options, and it's forced Iron Hands to even go for Terra Fire. So I do actually think that, well, while I'm on the subject of Slitherwing, I'm going to put this in the B tier, because Slitherwing, I think, objectively is just better Heracross, and I purely am comparing them just off of typing for what it's worth, but it's not just, well, let me rephrase, it's not just typing. They're both physical bug fightings. They both have similar physical attack stats, with Heracross being 125, Slitherwing being 135. They both have similar speed tiers. They're both even fairly similarly bulky, with the one edge that Slitherwing has being a slight SpDef buff, and also slightly better HP. Like, actually, it's slightly better than in every stat, but the highest being SpDef, which is a 10 base stat, with HP being 5 and PhysDef being 4. The speed is pretty similar, where Heracross only beats it by 4. Like, these are fairly comparable Pokemon in my opinion. The one edge that Slitherwing does have, though, really just comes from the bulk. It's slightly bulkier, and in tandem with Will-O-Wisp, it really does make a difference in this Pokemon. It's also, again, just a better abuser of Terastal, in my opinion. You could go for stuff like Terastal Rock, for example, to get around Talonflame. You would wall both stabs, and considering Talonflame is a really strong way to revenge this Pokemon, as well as stuff like Terra Flying Acro Moon, for example, as well, just another way that you could take the hit and then Will-O-Wisp. I do see Slithering as just a better option here as far as these bug fightings go. However, Heracross definitely isn't bad either. It's a good Tailwind abuser, and in tandem with stuff like Moxie or Guts, you could actually make us a pretty good snowball. However, it's too niche for my personal taste, and Slithering is decent enough. It's top cut a few times actually, so we'll give that B tier and Heracross C tier. Masquerain, D tier. It really only gets D tier actually for Intimidate. That's really the only reason it's getting in this slot. But Intimidate is such a good ability, objectively speaking. A Pokemon that is not some baby stage Pokemon would almost always get in this tier. I don't want to say definitively get in D tier or higher, because I'm sure that I'm going to forget about some Intimidator that's going to be really terrible. In fact, even just pulling up right now, I'm seeing Stantler, for example. So objectively, I don't want to promise that D tier is going to objectively be in the low spot for Intimidate, but it would be pretty hard for it not to be. Regardless though, in general, Masquerain's a fine enough Intimidator, I guess, and if nothing else, Masquerain, if I remember correctly, does also get some good roll compression, because this thing also does get Tailwind, which is kind of cool, so we'll give it D tier. Kricketune, F tier. I'm not going into this one. Fuck Kricketune. Vespiquen. I'm gonna go into this one, but this is also an F tier. Vespiquen, if nothing else, is just get a cool few things in its status move pool. For one, Destiny Bond plus T-Spikes, again, kind of useful just considering Dondozo, but even still not exactly super necessary, and I feel like there's just better Pokemon for it. But this also does get Taunt, which is kind of cool. As far as other Toxic Spikes Taunt users go though, we do have a few options actually. For one, if we go into even just other bug types, we have Spidops, which I would actually argue Spidops is a slight niche above, which I'll get into that in a bit. It's still probably gonna be F tier though. But even still, comparing to other Pokemon though, we have stuff like Meowscarada, which is one of the best Pokemon currently in VGC as far as Series 1 goes, and it's still a decent one in Series 2. We have Toedscruel, which Toedscruel actually also has a lot better utility than Vespiquen. Gengar, which I wouldn't really run T-Spikes Gengar, but you could, in theory, make it work, actually. Salazzle even could pull that off a lot better. In fact, we've seen Salazzle even cut a couple times recently. The point being is there's a lot better options as far as T-Spikes Taunt go, and Vespiquen's just way too slow to pull this off, albeit, again, I compared this to Spidops, but Spidops isn't exactly much faster. In fact, I think it's slower. But the issue with Vespiquen is the fact that it doesn't really have a way to boost its damage sustainably. Like I'm looking at this, for example, an attack order, the best thing it has is that it's a high crit move, and that's really the best setup that Vespiquen has in any way, shape, or form, which I wouldn't even really count that as setup. It doesn't even get like focus energy to pair with this, so objective F tier. Volcarona, this is truthfully be one of two A-rank bugs that we have on this list, but ultimately Volcarona is an insane terrestrial candidate this generation, and it's a really strong, bulky Quiver Dance option. Volcarona has still managed to hold the test of time against the Paradox Pokemon, and it's proving to still be one of the best Pokemon in this current metagame. If we actually pull up, and I'll put up on the side here, but I'll link it down below if someone reminds me. Well, if I forget, please someone remind me. But overall, though, this has proven to be a decent Pokemon, and among the Paradox metagame, I want to say that this ended up ranking at the wrong channel for it. Because I was gonna say I could have sworn this ended up being in the top 20. It might have even just bubbled out of top 10 to be honest. Yeah, so Volcarona actually slots. If we look through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 11, 12, 13th overall in terms of usage among common tournaments. We've seen it actually hit a total of 25 different teams, which might not sound like a lot, but considering the fact that after the first three that go from 129 with Iron Hands, 127 with Mungus, and 123 with Bundle, it drops off a whole 30 spots for the fourth place being Arcanine. And by the end of the top 10, we're at 38. So 25 teams featuring Volcarona among the current teams that have large competitors is pretty, this is among the top 10 Limitless tours that have the highest amount of signups. 25 teams is a lot of teams to be running Volcarona on, and it's a pretty high contender too. This thing is typically top cutting on multiple teams and events. It's really good option with stuff like Terra Water, Terra Grass, Terra Fire, Terra, really whatever. You can make a lot of different Terra types work. The point being though, Volcarona is, in my opinion, the gold standard of bug types, and it is definitely the bug type to compete with. Spupa gets D tier, and I'm only giving it D tier because of Friend Guard, if I'm going to be completely honest. But Friend Guard is actually such an obnoxious ability, and it's truthfully, it's not just Friend Guard. This thing also actually does get some cool utility. Stuff like Rage Powder and Sunsport, for example, could actually find a place on a team. And with a Violate, you are slightly better than, well, slightly bulkier than Vivillon, while also not having a 4x weakness to Rock, which is consistently a big issue for Vivillon, considering the fact it's one of the best spread moves in the game, being Rock Slide. So I gotta give it to Spupa. I could actually think of a reason you would run this in like a Series 1 meta team, and I solely mentioned Series 1 based on the fact that Series 1 was actually a fairly passive metagame, if we're gonna be honest. By the time that Roaring Moon, Fluttermane, etc. come into the game though, it's way too offensive of a metagame for Spupa to even remotely have a place, so D tier. We'll give it D tier solely off of that. Because when we compare it to stuff like Scyther, Masquerade, and Venomoth, these aren't real Pokemon in VGC if we're gonna be honest, so we'll give Spupa that. It fits the criteria of being a YouTuber Pokemon, in my opinion. Vivian, though, Vivian's an actual C tier. This is just a better version of Spupa. This thing does get some cool options, and it's not just a Friend Guard Pokemon. Vivian also has some cool niche with Compound Eyes, which could potentially be useful on Stun Spore sets or Sleep Powder sets, which you could actually use with stuff like, for example, Rage Powder. You could use with Quiver Dance and Hurricane, and you could make the work pretty well. I would probably run this with like a Terra Flying set, but you could in theory make Terra Dark work just to avoid any sort of pranks or taunt. You could also go with Terra Ghost, which could in theory be ran with Focus Sash, which would be useful for preserving your Focus Sash. And also getting around Fake Out, which is pretty cool. This gets Tailwind. It gets a lot of good options, and I think Vivian, objectively speaking, is a good C tier. Like, it's probably going to end up being the best C tier we have in this tier. But Vivian is just shy of B tier, and I think that once we start throwing other support Pokemon in B, we'll get into why a little bit more, that this ended up just missing the mark. Frostmoth actually also gets a C tier. I will say Frostmoth is probably going to be one of the most shaky of everything we're putting in the C tier today. And overall, I could actually get the argument. We've actually seen in a very recent tournament where Frostmoth ended up actually doing a pretty good performance overall. To put in perspective, this is actually the Beanie Brawl tournament that I recently was participant in. I had 193 participants total, and it ended up getting 9th overall with a 6-2 rating. This was a Terra Frostmoth. It ended up running the Terra Rock typing, which my guess was, again, for similarly to how we mentioned for other Pokemon, such as, I forget what Pokemon, I think it was Masquerade. It was something in that, like, B through F tier. But the point being, though, is it's Terra Rock, which obviously is helpful for stuff like Talonflame matchups, where Talonflame could just Brave Bird right into it. You get stuff like Wide Guard and Tailwind. You would potentially go for Infestation as well, which on this particular team I'm looking at actually could be pretty useful in terms of trapping opposing Pokemon and then smashing them with Tusk. But overall, or King Gambit as well, mind you. But the point being, though, is that Frostmoth actually could, in theory, have some good defensive use. With the Ice Scales ability especially, in tandem with just an overall good Spit F stat, you could actually make this into a pretty good Spit F tank. And I'm kind of shocked we haven't seen more Frostmoth, albeit I could maybe see this thing actually becoming useful as the season goes on. We could maybe see this thing adapt into something like a Fluttermane check, for example, or maybe this ends up adapting into like an Iron Bundle check. I don't really know how it's going to go. I don't see Frostmoth as being like a meta solution or anything, which is what's kind of keeping it out of B tier. But it's niche enough, and it's actually performing well enough to where I would say this is like, if there was a tier between B and C, I would put it in that, and it would probably be the Soulmon in that tier. But realistically though, I'm going to put it in C. Cleavor's up next. I'm giving this an A tier. Stone Axe is a pretty good move, and Cleavor overall having the sharpness ability, we've actually seen this perform really well with Gallade. Though I will say Cleavor is not nearly as good as Gallade in that sense, considering Gallade was a lot better adept at handling Dondozo, and that's why sharpness was really good. But even still, Cleavor has a lot going for it. Stone Axe, for example, will be pretty useful for handling stuff like Volcarona, or other just really hazard weak Pokemon that might be coming in later in the match. On top of this as well, the fact that Stone Axe is boosted by sharpness, and also the fact that you can get the Rock Stab off of it, you actually can make this into an attack that hits harder than Rock Slide, or at the very least comparable to Rock Slide. The one issue you would have though is Rock Slide obviously is a good flinching option, which even still you could actually utilize Rock Slide to be a good flinching option on Cleavor, and you could take this in tandem with the sharpness set and go with, for example, Rock Slide, Night Slash, and then probably Protect, and then probably like a Lunge or some sort of physical bug move. Maybe U-turn as well could be pretty good. The point being, though, is you could end up making Cleavor into a decent offensive option. Not only this, but it gets close combat as coverage for potential steel types that would otherwise probably wall Cleavor, which is a really big buff to the Scizor line in general this gen, but especially to Cleavor, I think it benefits the most. But overall, I think Cleavor will be a decent option. The Bug Rock typing could be really good on Tailwind teams, actually, as, for example, with Stabs plus close combat, and then protect, you could end up using this as a really good Tailwind breaker with the ability. Also, actually, Night Slash could be useful on that set because you would actually perfectly creep Gholdengo with this, and you could force a really good 50-50 between close combat and Night Slash for pre-Terra and post-Terra. Because especially since Gholdengo is most commonly running Terra Steel, and the fact that you perfectly creep that Pokemon, it does actually need to play a pretty big mind game in that sense. So Kleavor definitely could actually, in theory, just run 4 attacks with Life Orb and Sheer Force, or potentially Life Orb 4 attacks with Sharpness, and it could end up being a really good Pokemon. I think Kleavor definitely could be, it could have a case for B, but I think for now I'm going to put it in A. This is truthfully though just the fact that I don't really think there's a reason to lowball Kleavor, when I think in general the fact of how well it matches up against a lot of common Pokemon in Tailwind could actually be a good selling point for this. Spidops. Spidops gets the F tier, but this is definitely going to be like the best Pokemon in F tier. I'm not going to make a precedent of sorting these by the skill and tier. I'm going to put that out there right now because it's going to get really hectic as we get into types like Dark that are going to have like 40 or 50 Pokemon. But overall, Spidops I think has some merit in terms of the fact that it has the ability Stakeout, which is kind of cool. But Spidops does suffer a lot from the fact that it is a fairly frail Pokemon, in tandem with the fact that it's a pure bug type, which is pretty shit. If they made this thing bug fighting, I would actually put this in C tier. I think it could have a lot of merit with that. But Spidops overall does have some good things going for it. For one, Circle Throw is a pretty decent option to force the opponent to switch, and it does damage, which is something that similar to moves like Dragon Tail, for example. On top of this as well, we have Silk Trap, which is essentially Spidops' signature version of Protect, which in terms of any contact moves that might hit this Pokemon, stuff like Flare Blitz, for example, you actually drop the opponent's speed by 1 stage, which is pretty useful. It's a nice little form of speed control that Spidops could bring to the table in doubles, and it also gets around stuff like Imprison, which is, again, pretty useful for Spidops. You get some cool options like Sucker Punch here. You get stuff like Throat Chop, which is pretty useful for sound moves. You could pair something like a Roaring Moon, or just any other really very weak Pokemon to get around Sylveon. The point being is this has some options, and I could weirdly see this thing working, but only really in Series 1. I think the second you get into Series 2, this is way too unusable. And even still for Series 1, it was at best a YouTuber Pokemon. I think the other 4 could, in theory, make YouTuber Pokemon still work in Series 2. Spidops no longer does. We got the hype out on the Scarlet Violet train, and it's really only even a YouTuber Pokemon to begin with because it's Generation 9 Pokemon. It just misses the mark for me, in my opinion. Lokix is kind of interesting, actually. This thing could do some really good damage with Tinted Lens. I'm putting it in D tier solely for the fact that Lokix, it's what Spidops wishes it was. For one, this has Tinted Lens, which will just consistently do more damage, whereas Stakeout only really works on Switch. For two, this thing also has a dual typing of Bug and Dark, which actually is pretty decent, considering the fact that this has an outright immunity to Psychic, and also the fact that it's a much better speed for Tailwind is pretty cool. Sadly, though, this is a very priority-heavy Pokemon, and when you're trying to take on Psychic types, it's actually pretty bad this gen, because 2 of the most common Psychic types are Indeedee and Armarouge, which, of course, are typically ran on Psy Spam cores, so it's not really good. And even still, as far as the 3rd most common, weirdly enough, that might unironically be Screamtail, if I had to guess. I can't really think of one offhand, but I'm sure there's a better one. But Screamtail's definitely been pulling up recently in tournaments, actually on Perish Trap teams with Gothitelle. Which I guess Gothitel's also been seeing some good usage. Ferrig actually has more usage than all those Pokemon, by the way. I don't know how I forgot about Farigiraf. But Farigiraf would probably be a really good way to also block this thing, considering it has Armor Tail, which, again, another good way to stop priority. So as far as the best Psychic type you could actually threaten with this Pokemon, it would probably be one of Gothitelle or Screamtail, which says a lot that it's like the 4th or 5th best that you could finally touch. And even still, if you make the case that Screamtail would be that 4th, the fact that it's neutral also hurts Lokix's case a lot. This still does have some good uses though for stuff like Brute Bonnet, for example, which actually has a lot of usage right now. It's also good for Roaring Moon, which is in the top 10, and Yasirata is still a fairly viable Pokemon too, and you could go for first impression on that. So this has some cool like niche cases, but objectively this is just a really underwhelming Pokemon in my opinion. Finally though, we do have Rapska. Now I definitely think really highly of Rapska. I think it's fallen off as far as the format goes for Series 2. I think it's a lot harder to make this thing work. However, I'm still gonna give this thing a C tier. I think Revival Blessing in tandem with something like an Iron Hands, for example, is fairly underexplored, but you could actually make this thing into a really big monster. It's still a really good team supporting option in my opinion, and despite the fact that it has a bug psychic typing, typically stuff like Terra Water could be beneficial as far as making this into a better defensive type, though I would also recommend looking into something like a Terra Grass this time around because it would help a lot with Iron Hands matchups. Overall, though, I think this thing has a lot of merit. It's a really slow trigger setter that also has a fairly good special attack and special defense stat.
You could definitely invest this thing pretty physically defensive heavy and just make it a really good sponge. You get some good utility with, like, again, Revival Blessing, but you also get stuff like Recover. And overall, I think that Rabsca definitely could end up actually seeing some use in Series 2. I just think it's a lot harder to use. If we were only tearing off a Series 1, I would easily give this thing a B tier. You could make a case for it. Well, if we were only tearing off a Series 1, you would actually maybe make a case for this thing being like a bottom of A tier. So, like, Volcarona would be the S rank at that point. But that's really the only reason why. Sadly, though, because we're tiering this with everything in mind, we're gonna give this thing a C tier, but it's probably the best Pokemon in C. Let me know what you guys think down below, though, and if you enjoy this tier list and you learned something new, leave a like below and subscribe. Answer the comment question of the day: what's your favorite bug type to use in competitive? And I'll see you guys in tomorrow's video, where we're going to be having we're going to probably be having a draft game. I will say, though, there's been a little bit of issues with scheduling because of me getting sick last week, so we might end up actually pushing that off to Monday or Tuesday even and swapping it with another Series 1 ladder game. But the point being, you'll see something VGC related tomorrow, and until then, I'll see you guys later. Oh, right, channel members. How did I forget about the channel members? I'm so sorry, guys. Shout out to channel members, of course, being Josh AK Ultra Player, Mia, Zeke Zero, Matt O'Shea, Nox Nocturnal, Koemi, and Slade. Your guys' support is greatly appreciated on the channel, and if you guys want to become members for just a couple dollars a month, your support is greatly appreciated. You'll get bonus bonus videos every Saturday at around 7 to 9 o'clock at night, roughly. Usually it's around the 7 to 9 range. But yeah, just a couple dollars a month, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace out, guys.